Alright, good evening. This is Block 2, Lecture number 5, The Colonial Economy in 1750, at the beginning of the, what we're going to call the Revolutionary Era. Let's start out by saying this. In 1750, the 13 colonies were the freest and richest society on earth for the average person. The average person in the 13 colonies ate better, lived better, and had more material, possessions than the average person anywhere else on Earth. That the 13 colonies were truly a haven for people willing to do a lot of hard work and succeed by their lights and succeed by their abilities alone, especially in the North. Let's start up north in this incredibly, obviously not wealthy compared to us, but for 1740, the average person in the 13 colonies lived better than the average person anywhere else on the planet. Ate more, had more land than the average person anywhere. Taxes were virtually zero. It was as free as anybody on Earth has ever been in a lot of different ways. The North is dominated by small middle-class farms in which people grow food for their family and they grow a surplus that they sell to the port towns and the port cities where it is shipped to different places in the world, shipped to Europe, shipped to different colonies, shipped to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean. Farmers in the North are still living on their relatively small family plots. They are growing food for themselves. They are growing food to sell for cash, or at least to barter in kind. Because in the North, the other thing that's largely going on is a whole lot of trade and a whole lot of illegal manufacturing. We remember mercantilism. The colonies are not supposed to be manufacturing anything, but with Britain's kind of light touch, salutary neglect, and just the fact that it's difficult to run the colonies from London, when there's a need, people fill the need. Like there's iron bars, for example, are not allowed to be produced in England. In the colonies, iron bars have to be produced in England. Well, but they're really expensive from England. And nobody from England is in the colonies kind of checking up, so a lot of people in America just start iron foundries and build iron bars. Is it technically illegal? Yep. Is anybody checking on them? Nope. And if anyone does, they'll probably be bribed out of the way. So all throughout the North, there is all of this small-scale manufacturing. Hats, furniture, wood, iron bars, anything you could think of that makes, a farmer's life easier, or a merchant's life easier, or a tradesman's life easier, is largely being produced in the North. Its quality might not be quite as good as its quality back in England, but it's certainly better than the having to pay the premium price for things from Europe. Manufacturing is done through what's known as the putting out system, where in some cases, a lot of cases people do it individually, but if you are a larger manufacturer, you provide the raw materials to different people who are working for you. They produce what it is you are asking them to produce, then you go around the end of the day, collect it. That's why it's called putting out. Every day you give them stuff, and then they put it out back to you. But the economy in the North is rolling along very, very happily. As you can read in Johnson, most white men, which is most of the men in the North, between the ages of 25 and 54, you have a very small chance of living in poverty. Most men, by the time they are 25 years old, are economically established, middle class citizens of one of those northern colonies, whether they are farming or trading or manufacturing, or they are craftsmen or anything like that. Life in the North provides a more comfortable economic existence than most anywhere else on Earth. The southern economy, as we have seen, is fundamentally different. The southern economy is based on cash crops, tobacco, indigo, rice, which are grown on these large plantations, boarded up onto barges, and shipped up north to be sent on ships across the ocean, either to England or to any of the English colonies. That's mercantilism. You try to send it within that English system, that English global economic mercantilist system. problem is, it's very successful. It's very lucrative to be in the tobacco, indigo, rice business. The problem is that it's not very liquid, and what that means is a southern planter only gets paid once a year. Everything that an elite southern planter buys, he's buying on credit. Then the one time a year, all of his tobacco, rice, indigo gets shipped to Europe, he pays off all the debts that he can. Here's the problem. Problem is, if the price of indigo, rice, cotton has gone down too low, or he's spent a little bit more than he should have, he goes into debt. And the price and what he gets for his rice indigo tobacco is not enough to cover his debts. But if you're Thomas Jefferson, you can't really reduce your standard of living very much because you are a gentleman and you are expected to look, act, dress, entertain in a particular way. And so someone like Thomas Jefferson, who was just in debt his whole life, goes into more debt every year, really, because he sells his crop once, and then for the next 12 months, everything he is buying is on credit until his crop comes in again and he gets to pay off some of those debts. Now, one of the reasons why it was difficult to make your money back with cash crops is because of the mercantilist system. Tariffs were put on things on their way into England, so that Jefferson and his other southern planter buddies, if not Jefferson, he was too young at the time, but people like he would become, are paying kind of a premium price to send their stuff to England to participate in this mercantilist system. So although these planters down south are kind of on the surface, they look very, very wealthy, and they produce, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in crops, they are constantly in debt to British merchants, English merchants, English trading houses, and that's going to play kind of a subsidiary role in the Revolution. That when Thomas Jefferson and George Washington broke away from the British Crown, they were also breaking away from some pretty significant debts. Did that drive them? No. But was it a subsidiary factor? Absolutely. The other people down south, the yeomanry, are producing, stuff for the local elites. If Thomas Jefferson is growing tobacco and rice and indigo, the yeomanry around his farm, they're growing the food that he uses, some of the furniture that he doesn't buy from Europe, the stuff that he makes is the yeomanry. The poor whites are back in the back country, kind of scratching out a living from the poor soil at the base, and the Piedmont at the base of the Appalachian Mountains. And then, of course, you had your large population of slaves, as we talked about last night. So we're looking at a set of colonies, and there are still 13 separate colonies, although they are seeing eye to eye on more things by 1750, dominated by small farming, trading, and manufacturing in the north, and dominated by cash crops down in the south. That's going to be that way for a very, very long time. Because of the fact that so much of the manufacturing was illegal, and because of mercantilist policies, a banking industry never really develops in the colonies much at all. The American banking system is primitive. And that's going to lead to some serious consequences down the road, that Americans grow to distrust bankers. Americans go to distrust high finance in a lot of different ways. The American banking system is going to be a shambles for a very, very long time. And part of that reason is it never got off the ground during the colonial era because so much of what people did in the colonies was technically illegal. And it's tough to kind of establish a banking system when a huge percentage of the economic activity that people are actually doing is not technically legal. You don't want to have a long balance sheet of all the smuggling that you've done this year and all the illegal trading that you've done. So the banking system takes a long time to develop in the United States. There's no money in the United States really either. That's another big thing. Mercantilist policy. Remember, mercantilism, you want to try, the home country, England, is trying to make as big a pile of gold as they can. Any time that anybody wants to buy something from England, they have to pay in coin. They have to pay in gold. So anytime that Thomas Jefferson wants to buy the latest, dress for his daughter, he is sending gold to England and is getting a product back. When John Adams, living in his, in his house in New England, when he wants to buy, a nice new desk, a high quality desk, a craftsman-like desk, because he's an important lawyer, he buys that from England. He pays in coin, and the desk comes. So America during the colonial era was constantly short of actual cash. In the dealings with other colonials, in the dealings with other Americans, it was purely a barter economy. Or an economy with kind of bills of trade. You would say, I own, especially down south, 300 pounds of tobacco. I'll give you 10 pounds of tobacco for, whatever it is that you are buying. You wouldn't actually move tobacco around. You would hold a little piece of paper that says, I now own 10 pounds of your tobacco. Because there was so little money floating around the colonial system. Money that did come in usually came in from the Caribbean, but it was back to England within months. The United States is always running an official imbalance of trade with the mother country. The United States is always, always, always spending more on stuff from England than England is spending on stuff from the colonies. Those are the official numbers. What the actual numbers are is very unclear, because everybody was kind of operating on the side. So it's hard to know how much Americans were actually sending to other colonies, how much Americans were actually sending to other British colonies and other colonies in the Caribbean, because a lot of what they were doing was technically illegal. But it's hard to raise capital in the United States because there's no money, and the colonies have a negative balance of trade. There's a primitive banking system. There's very little actual hard money in the colonies, and so much of what is going on is kind of done under the table. Despite all of the problems, despite the problem of the balance of trade, despite the problem of not having much hard currency, despite the problem of having these rules in place that nobody really followed, despite the problem of all of the debt that kind of the elites in the South were going into, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, the average American in the 13 colonies lived better, ate more, ate healthier, lived among better circumstances than any other average person in any place in the world at that time. Visitors to the colonies were always amazed by how well ordinary people lived. And in Johnson, there's a bunch of examples of this. People said that, in America, pigs eat like ordinary people do in England. Pennsylvania was called the best poor man's country in the world. Poor people owned land. Poor people, bought finished goods. Poor people. There was this complex economy, some above ground, some underground, that made the American people. And by the 1750s, Americans are referring to themselves as Americans. We're going to talk about that in Block 3. Made them, quite frankly, the richest people on earth. In the middle. There was no there was, down south, some of the elites are incredibly land wealthy, but they're not cash wealthy. And in the north, you start to get, a banking, manufacturing, trading elite. But no one in the United States is living in palaces and castles like they are in England. That there is a degree of economic middleness in most of the 13 colonies. And that's what's going on the eve of revolutionary America.